Flying always felt like freedom to me. As a flight attendant with 6 years of experience, I loved being up in the air, seeing the world from above. But now, I can't even look at a plane without feeling chills crawl up my spine. This is the story of Flight 237. It started like any other red-eye flight, a late-night trip from New York to Los Angeles. The cabin lights were dim, and most passengers were either dozing off or scrolling on their phones. I walked down the aisle, checking seatbelts and smiling at sleepy travelers. The hum of the engines was steady and soothing, a sound I had grown used to over the years. We were about an hour into the flight when things started to feel off. I was at the back of the plane, organizing drink trays, when I noticed the smell. It was faint at first, like something metallic or burnt. I asked the other attendants if they noticed it, but they shook their heads. "Probably nothing," one of them said. But the smell grew stronger. That's when the first strange thing happened. A passenger in seat 17A, an elderly man with a gray beard, called me over. He was pale and sweating, his eyes darting around nervously. "Ma'am," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Do you see her?" "See who?" I asked, looking around. "The little girl," he said, pointing toward the aisle. I looked where he pointed, but the aisle was empty. "Sir, I don't see anyone," I said gently, thinking maybe he was disoriented or dreaming. He grabbed my wrist, his grip surprisingly strong. "She's standing right there," he hissed. "She's looking at me." My heart raced. I pulled away and reassured him I would get help, but as I walked toward the cockpit to inform the captain, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Then came the whispers. At first, I thought it was just the hum of the engines or passengers chatting, but it wasn't. The sound was faint and eerie, like someone murmuring just behind my ear. I turned around, but no one was there. By now, the other flight attendants were starting to notice things too. One of them, Sarah, came to me, her face pale. "I swear, I just saw someone sitting in 12B, she said. "But that seat's been empty since takeoff." We both walked over to check, but 12B was indeed empty. The seat belt was neatly folded, untouched. Passengers were getting restless. A woman in the back complained her overhead light kept flickering, but when we checked, it was fine. Another man said he felt someone tugging on his sleeve, but no one was nearby. Then the turbulence started. At first it was light, the kind we're trained to handle, but soon the plane began to shake violently. The captain's voice came over the intercom, calm but firm. "Everyone, please remain seated with your seat belts fastened." The lights flickered, passengers screamed, and then for a moment everything went pitch black. When the lights came back on, chaos erupted. A child in the middle row was crying hysterically, saying, "She's here! She's here!" People were shouting, trying to calm him down. The elderly man in 17A was slumped over, unconscious, and then I saw her. At the end of the aisle, near the emergency exit, stood a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 6 years old. Her long black hair hung limp over her face, and she wore an old-fashioned white dress, soaked as if she had been caught in the rain. She was staring straight at me. I blinked, and she was gone. Panic surged through the cabin, the turbulence worsened, and the plane felt like it was being tossed around by invisible hands. I ran toward the cockpit, desperate to get answers from the captain, but when I opened the door, I froze. The captain and co-pilot were staring straight ahead, their faces pale and blank, as if in a trance. The instruments on the dashboard flickered erratically, and the altimeter spun wildly. "Captain?" I said, my voice shaking. He didn't respond. "Behind me. The whispers grew louder. One man behind me. On my balcony." I turned around and saw passengers staring at something behind me, their faces frozen in terror. Slowly, I turned back toward the cockpit. The little girl was standing between the captain and co-pilot. Her dark eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, everything stopped. The plane, the passengers, even time itself, it all went silent. Then she smiled. The next thing I remember is waking up in a hospital bed. They told me the plane made an emergency landing in Denver. The passengers were fine, though no one could explain the turbulence or the strange events on board. The captain and co-pilot had no memory of what happened, and the flight recorder was mysteriously blank during the time of the incident. I quit my job a week later. I still don't know who that girl was or what she wanted, but I'll never forget her face. Sometimes, late at night, I hear the hum of an airplane engine and those whispers, and I wonder if she's still out there waiting for her next flight. You'd think that after surviving something like that, you'd be grateful to be alive, but the truth is, I wasn't sure I was free. After I quit my job, I moved back to my small hometown in Wisconsin. I figured the quiet would help me process everything that happened. But the whispers didn't stop. They started as faint echoes in my dreams, blending into the sound of the wind or the rustling trees. Sometimes I'd wake up gasping, convinced I heard the hum of an airplane engine in my bedroom. It felt like the girl, wasn't done with me. One night, about a month after the flight, I decided to reach out to the other crew members. I needed to know if anyone else was experiencing the same things. Sarah, the flight attendant who had seen the empty seat in 12B, answered my call almost immediately. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "I thought I was losing my mind," she confessed. "I keep seeing shadows in my apartment, and I swear, sometimes I hear her laughing." We decided to meet up at a cafe in Chicago, halfway between where we both lived. When we saw each other, it was like looking into a mirror, both of us pale, tired, and haunted. As we sat down to talk, Sarah told me something that made my blood run cold. "After the emergency landing," she said, lowering her voice, "I overheard one of the investigators talking. They found something on the plane, something that wasn't supposed to be there." "What do you mean?" I asked. "They found wet footprints in the cockpit. Small, like a child's. But here's the thing. They didn't lead anywhere. They just stopped." I sat back in my chair, my hands trembling. "Do you think she followed us?" I whispered. Sarah nodded, her eyes darting around the room as if the little girl might appear at any moment. "I don't think she ever left." A few weeks later, I got a call from the airline. They wanted me to come in for a meeting. At first, I thought they were trying to convince me to come back, but when I arrived at the office, I realized it wasn't that simple. The man sitting across from me was a corporate investigator. His gray suit was sharp and his expression was colder than ice. He slid a folder across the table toward me. "We've been reviewing the incident on Flight 237, he said, his voice clipped. "There are, anomalies." I opened the folder and immediately wished I hadn't. Inside were photos from the cockpit, the wet footprints Sarah had mentioned, smeared across the control panel. There were also images of seat 12B, where the empty seatbelt had been snapped clean in half, as if someone, or something, had yanked on it with incredible force. But the worst photo was the last one. It was a grainy black and white still from the cabin camera, taken moments before the lights went out. In the image, passengers were screaming and clutching their seats, and standing in the middle of the aisle, staring directly into the camera, was the little girl. Her eyes were completely black. After that meeting, I started digging into the history of Flight 237. It wasn't easy. Airlines don't exactly advertise their ghost stories, but I managed to track down an article about an incident on the same route nearly 20 years earlier. It was a smaller plane, a private jet, carrying a wealthy family and their young daughter. The pilot reported severe turbulence before losing contact with air traffic control. The wreckage was never found, but it was assumed the plane went down somewhere over the Rockies. The girl's name was Emily. She was 6 years old. I couldn't believe it. Was it possible that Emily's spirit had somehow latched on to Flight 237, that she was still searching for her family? I reached out to the reporter who had written the article. She was hesitant at first, but when I mentioned what had happened on the flight, her tone changed. "You're not the first person to reach out to me about this," she said. "I've heard similar stories from other passengers and crew members over the years. Always on the same route, always late at night." "Is there any way to stop her?" I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. The reporter sighed. "I don't know, but if she's tied to the route, maybe avoiding it is your best chance at peace." I wish it were that simple. No matter where I go, the whispers follow me. I've moved 3 times in the past year, but it doesn't matter. Every so often, I hear the faint sound of an engine humming in the distance, even when there's no plane in the sky. Sometimes, I wake up in the middle of the night and find my windows fogged up, like someone or something has been standing outside, watching me. I'm not the only one either. Sarah called me last week, her voice shaking. She said she woke up to find a single wet footprint in her hallway. "I think she's coming for us," she whispered. I don't know how much longer I can live like this. If you ever find yourself on a red-eye flight and the lights flicker, or you feel an icy chill down your spine, remember this story. And if you see a little girl in a white dress standing in the aisle, don't look her in the eyes. It's been over a year now, and I've done everything I can to escape her. But Emily, if that's really her name, still finds me. I've even seen therapists trying to convince myself that this is all just PTSD or some bizarre trauma-induced delusion. But they don't understand. How could they? They don't wake up in the middle of the night to find their bedroom freezing cold, the sound of a child's faint giggle echoing from the shadows. I've started keeping a journal, documenting every strange occurrence. Last week, I wrote about the time my kitchen faucet turned on by itself, water pouring out and overflowing the sink. When I ran to shut it off, the water was ice cold, and there were tiny wet footprints leading from the sink to the front door. I tried following them, but they stopped abruptly, just like on the plane. Sarah and I stay in touch, but every call is more troubling than the last. 2 nights ago, she told me she woke up to find her TV on, playing static. The remote was on the other side of the room. As she approached the screen to turn it off, she swore she saw the faint outline of a little girl's face in the static, her dark eyes staring back at her. Sarah cried as she told me she's afraid to sleep in her own house now. Desperate for answers, I returned to the airport where Flight 237 landed that night. I found an older mechanic who'd been working there for decades and asked him if he knew anything about strange happenings on that route. At first, he laughed it off, but when I mentioned the little girl, his face turned pale. "We don't talk about that flight," he muttered, refusing to say more. The fear in his eyes said enough. Wow, I feel like I'm living on borrowed time. I feel like I'm living on borrowed time. I've started noticing signs that she's growing stronger. The whispers are louder, the chills more frequent, and then, just as suddenly as she appeared, she was standing at the foot of my bed, soaking wet, her pale face illuminated by the glow of the streetlight outside. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. I froze, unable to move or scream. And then, just as suddenly as she appeared, she was gone. But the smell of damp earth and metal lingered long after she disappeared.